The knock came just after sundown on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1882, and Abraham Finley answered his front door with a screaming infant tucked in the crook of his left arm, and a look on his face that belonged to a man who had not slept in 4 days. He stood there in the doorway of his ranch house on the outskirts of Caldwell, Kansas, his dark hair sticking up at odd angles, a smear of what appeared to be mashed sweet potato across the front of his flannel shirt, his boots unlaced because he had not had 2 free hands to tie them since Thursday, and he stared at the young woman on his porch as though he were not entirely certain she was real. She stared back at him with wide brown eyes that caught the last copper light of the evening, a leather satchel pressed against her side, her dark hair pinned up beneath a practical hat, her riding dress dusty from a long journey. She was perhaps 24 years old, olive-complexioned, with the kind of face that was not immediately beautiful but became more so the longer you looked at it, the kind of face that held things, that thought before it spoke. The baby, who appeared to be approximately 3 months old and entirely committed to making the loudest noise her small lungs could produce, showed no sign of stopping. The young woman on the porch looked at the man. She looked at the baby. She looked back at the man. "Mr. Abraham Finley," she said, raising her voice slightly above the infant's protests. "Yes," he said, and then because the baby chose that moment to escalate further, he bounced her once, twice, 3 times, looking down at her with a helplessness so genuine it was almost painful to witness. "Yes, that is me. I am sorry about the noise. She has been like this for the better part of an hour and I cannot figure out what she wants." The young woman on the porch did not seem put off by the crying. She looked at the baby with an expression that was professional, assessing, and then she looked back at Abraham Finley, and her expression shifted into something far more complicated, something that carried the weight of whatever she had ridden a long distance to say. "My name is Effie Wallace," she said. "I work for Dr. Harlan Prout over in Wellington. I have come because I am afraid I carry news about your brother, Mr. Finley, about Thomas." The color drained from Abraham's face so quickly it was like watching a candle get snuffed. His arm tightened fractionally around the baby, a reflex, the gesture of a man bracing himself. "Come inside," he said quietly. She stepped over the threshold into a house that told a story without needing words. There was evidence of a woman's touch, but the evidence was fading, becoming buried under the accumulating disorder of a man doing too many things at once, and doing none of them with the calm he required. A cradle stood in the corner of the main room, quilted with squares of blue and yellow calico. A pot sat on the iron stove that had clearly boiled dry at some point and been rescued. There were 2 coffee cups on the table, one for a man and one for a woman, and the woman's cup had not been moved in what looked like a very long time. It still had a ring of dried coffee inside it. Effie Wallace noticed the cup. She noticed everything with the quiet, careful attention of someone who had trained herself to observe, who worked alongside a physician and had learned that details mattered. Abraham Finley set the baby against his shoulder and turned to face her. In the lamplight she could see him more clearly now. He was 31 years old, tall and lean in the way of men who worked their own land and did not waste motion, with dark eyes that were red at the edges from exhaustion and something else, something that had been there longer than just these past sleep-deprived days. "Tell me," he said simply. Effie set her satchel on the floor and clasped her hands in front of her. She had delivered bad news before, working alongside Dr. Prout. It never became easy, but she had learned to meet a person's eyes when she did it, because looking away was a cruelty disguised as kindness. "Your brother Thomas was brought to Dr. Prout's clinic in Wellington 6 days ago," she said. "He had been caught in a flash flood crossing Slate Creek. By the time men pulled him out, he had been in the water a very long time. Dr. Prout did everything that could be done, Mr. Finley. Thomas fought very hard, but he passed away 4 days ago on a Friday morning just as the sun was coming up." The only sound in the room for a long moment was the baby, who had quieted somewhat to a rhythmic, hiccuping cry, as though even she sensed the gravity of what had just been spoken. Abraham Finley closed his eyes. His jaw tightened. He breathed through his nose, one long, controlled breath, and then another, the way a man breathes when he is determined not to come apart in front of a stranger. He was 26 years old, Abraham said, and it was not a question, just a fact he needed to say aloud, perhaps to make it real. Yes, Effie said softly. He was. Another silence. The lamp flame bent in a draft from the ill-fitted window frame. The baby, Effie said carefully because she had to ask, is she Thomas's daughter? Abraham opened his eyes. He looked down at the infant against his shoulder with an expression so complex it could not have been painted by any artist working in a single afternoon. Her name is Clara, he said. Her mother was Nora, Thomas's wife. Nora died 3 weeks ago. Childbed fever. She never got well after Clara was born. He paused. I did not know that Thomas went to Wellington. I thought he went to find someone to help with the baby. He said he was going to find help. I told him I could manage. We argued about it. He left anyway. A long, fractured pause. He always did what he thought was right, even when we argued. Effie felt the ache of it settle in her chest like something physical. A man who had lost his sister-in-law and now his brother, and was left holding an infant he had no idea how to care for, and had been doing it alone, and had not slept properly in nearly a week. "Mr. Finley," she said, and her voice was very gentle. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" He blinked as though the question surprised him by being about something so ordinary. "I had some bread this morning, or yesterday morning. I am not certain which." The baby began to cry in earnest again, a different register now, the high, urgent sound of hunger. "She is hungry," Effie said. "I know," Abraham said, and the exhaustion in those 2 words was enormous. "I have been feeding her with a bottle. I found a goat. A neighbor woman showed me how to prepare the milk, but she does not always take it easily, and I cannot always tell when she wants it versus when she wants something else versus when she just wants to be held, and I seem to always pick the wrong one." Effie Wallace made a decision in that moment. It was not an impulsive decision, because Effie was not an impulsive woman. It was the kind of decision that settles into you gradually and then simply presents itself as the only logical course of action, the way a river finds its way around a boulder. "Where is the goat's milk?" she asked. He looked at her. "I beg your pardon. The goat's milk. The bottle, where is it? I will feed her while you eat something, and then you are going to sleep for at least 4 hours, and we are going to figure out what to do next." Abraham Finley stared at her for a moment that stretched long enough to become something. Not awkward, not uncomfortable, but something real and searching. The way people look at each other when they are trying to determine whether they are safe. "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know I do not have to," Effie said. "I am offering." He handed her the baby. It was such a simple act, but it was not simple at all. He had been holding Clara for 4 days almost without pause, and handing her to this stranger in his doorway was the first time he had let her go. And when Effie took the small, warm weight of her against her own chest, Abraham Finley let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped in him for a week. Effie settled Clara against her left arm, adjusting her position with the practiced ease of someone who had assisted at childbirths and helped young mothers in the early weeks, and she said, "The milk, Mr. Finley." He found the bottle. He showed her where he had been keeping the goat's milk in a covered pail near the back window where it stayed cool. Effie warmed a small amount on the stove while walking the baby in slow circles, which quieted Clara from outright screaming to the watchful, wide-eyed assessment of an infant who is trying to determine whether this new person is trustworthy. "You are a very serious baby," Effie murmured to Clara, who blinked enormous gray eyes at her. "That is all right. Serious is fine." Abraham watched her from across the room with an expression he was not entirely aware he was wearing, which was the expression of a drowning man who has just grabbed hold of a rope. "You should eat something," Effie said without looking up. "Right," he said, and moved to the kitchen. She fed Clara while Abraham ate bread and cold beans, which were the first things he could locate without much effort, and slowly, like the easing of a wire that has been pulled taut, Some of the rigid exhaustion in his shoulders began to release. "How did you come to be working for Dr. Prout?" He asked because he needed something to talk about, something to fill the space that grief was taking up, just for a little while. Effie looked up from Clara. "My father was a physician in Missouri," she said. "He taught me what he could, because I was curious, and he did not believe curiosity ought to be discouraged on account of a person being a woman. When he passed, I came west looking for work. Dr. Prout is one of the few men I have encountered who will allow a woman to do more than scrub floors and boil linens." A small, dry note in her voice that was not quite humor but was adjacent to it. "I assist with examinations, prepare medicines, keep records, and occasionally deliver bad news when the doctor himself is occupied with a patient who cannot be left." "I am glad it was you who came," Abraham said, and he meant something very specific by it, which was that the way she had told him had been kind and clear, and had not made him feel that he needed to perform composure he did not possess. Effie looked at him for a moment, and something shifted in her expression, something that was warmer than professional courtesy. "I am sorry for your loss," she said. "Both losses, Nora and Thomas." He nodded once, looking down at his hands on the table. Clara had begun to take the bottle with serious, focused effort, her small hands curling and uncurling against Effie's forearm. They stayed in that quiet for a while, the lamplight steady, the prairie wind moving against the walls of the house with the low voice it had in autumn. And for the first time in 4 days, Abraham Finley felt something other than panic. He slept for 6 hours that night on the daybed in the back room, which was more sleep than he had accumulated in the previous 4 nights combined. And Effie Wallace sat in the rocking chair in the main room with Clara, who slept against her for 3 hours, woke to eat again, and slept again, apparently having decided that the new person holding her was, in fact, trustworthy. When Abraham came out the next morning, his hair still disordered from sleep but his eyes clear in a way they had not been the night before, he found Effie at the stove making coffee and Clara in the cradle, awake but quiet, staring at the ceiling with the contemplative air of a philosopher. "You stayed," he said. "She needed feeding at 2 o'clock in the morning," Effie said simply. "And again at 5. It seemed impractical to wake you." He stood in the doorway of the kitchen for a long moment. "I do not know how to thank you." "Coffee first," Effie said and handed him a cup. "Thank me later." He took the coffee and they stood in the early morning light that came through the east window, that clean, pale autumn light that makes everything look newly made, and drank in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who are finding that they fit into each other's quiet without friction. "I need to go back to Wellington today," Effie said. "Dr. Prout will need me, but I want to make sure that you have a plan before I go." Abraham's grip on the coffee cup tightened almost imperceptibly. "A plan," he said. "For Clara. You cannot run a cattle operation and care for an infant alone. You need help. Is there a woman in town who could come in?" "A neighbor." Abraham was quiet for a moment, turning the question over. "Mrs. Havorson, my nearest neighbor, already has 6 of her own, and her husband is laid up with a broken leg. I would not ask it of her. There is no one else nearby." He paused. "I had thought I might write to an aunt in St. Louis, my mother's sister, but she is elderly and the journey is difficult, and by the time a letter reached her and she replied, weeks would have passed." "What about hiring someone from town?" "With what?" He said, and not bitterly, just honestly. "I have the ranch. I have cattle, but I have no cash money to speak of until I sell the cattle in the spring. Thomas was the one who managed our accounts because he was better with figures. I do not even know what we owe or what we are owed." Effie set down her coffee cup on the kitchen counter and looked at him directly. The morning light was honest with her face, and it showed a woman who was thinking hard, who was weighing things that she was not going to say carelessly. "I could come back," she said. The words sat between them with a weight and a clarity that surprised them both. "I have a day off on Sundays," she said, and her voice was measured, as though she was explaining a thing to herself as much as to him. "And I could perhaps arrange with Dr. Prute to come out on Saturdays as well for a time. I could help you establish a proper routine for Clara. Teach you what I know, which is not everything, but it is more than you currently have." Abraham looked at her. He looked at her the way he had the night before, that searching, trying to determine if you are safe look, except this time there was something else layered underneath it, something he was not going to name yet because it was too new and the grief was too fresh, and he was not a man who moved without deliberation. "That is a very generous offer," he said carefully. "It is a practical one," Effie said. "I cannot in good conscience ride back to Wellington and leave a man alone with an infant and no idea what to do when I have the knowledge to help." "You came to deliver bad news," he said. "I did," she agreed. "And now you are offering to come back on your days off to help with a baby that is not yours." "I am," she said, and there was something in her brown eyes that was not quite defiant and not quite amused, but was some particular quality of Effie Wallace that he was beginning to understand was characteristic of her, which was a kind of calm, certain forthrightness that did not require the approval of anyone watching. "All right," Abraham said. "I accept. And I will find a way to repay you." "You do not need to repay me," she said. "I will find a way," he said again, quietly, and the firmness in his voice made her understand that it was a matter of his dignity, of the specific kind of pride that a man like Abraham Finley carried without ever making it a burden on others, and so she did not argue. She left before noon, having first given him a thorough and detailed set of instructions regarding Clara's feeding schedule, what to watch for in terms of her health, how to tell the difference between different kinds of crying, and what to do if Clara developed a fever. She wrote all of it down in clear, legible script on 2 sheets of paper from her satchel, and left them on the kitchen table where he could find them easily. When her horse had disappeared down the wagon track toward the main road, Abraham stood on his porch and held his niece and felt, for the first time since Nora had died, something that was not purely the pressing weight of obligation. He still grieved Thomas. He grieved Thomas with a fierceness that would take years to become familiar and bearable. But underneath that grief, like a small but persistent warmth, was the thought of the woman who had ridden out to his ranch at dusk to deliver the worst news of his year, and had then stayed through the night to feed his niece, and had drunk coffee with him in the morning light and had offered to come back. He looked down at Clara. "She is interesting," he told her. Clara blinked and grabbed his shirt collar. "I think so too," he said. The following Sunday, Effie Wallace rode out to the Finley ranch as she had said she would. She arrived mid-morning to find Abraham in the yard trying to mend a fence post with Clara strapped to his chest, in a length of folded blanket. He had fashioned into something functional if not particularly elegant, a solution that seemed to be working because Clara was asleep. He looked up when he heard the horse, and the expression on his face was something he clearly tried to moderate to simple greeting and did not entirely succeed at, because there was relief in it and something else, something that lived a little deeper. "You came," he said. "I said I would," Effie replied, dismounting. She was dressed practically as before, but she had changed her hat, a small and meaningless detail that he noticed and then felt slightly foolish for noticing. She assessed Clara at once and then assessed him. "She looks well," she said. "You both look better." "I slept," he said. "Following your instructions helped considerably. She has a pattern. Once I understood the pattern, it became more manageable." Effie smiled, and it was the first time he had seen her smile with any real openness, and it did something unreasonable to his composure. "Of course she has a pattern," Effie said. "All babies do. They just require someone patient enough to observe it." They spent the morning together working through what had become, in the 10 days since Effie's first visit, the most pressing practical challenges of Abraham's situation. Effie examined the household accounts that Thomas had kept in a ledger she found in the roll-top desk, and she was brisk and unsentimental about it, which Abraham appreciated because it was exactly what he needed. Someone who would look at the numbers without the emotional weight he carried regarding everything Thomas had touched. "You are not in debt," she said. You have a workable surplus. If the cattle sale in spring goes as the previous years did, you will be comfortable for another year. The ranch is solvent." He sat across the kitchen table from her with his hands flat on the surface and let out a long breath. "Thomas was always the one who worried about money. I worried about the cattle and the land." "Then you can continue to worry about the cattle and the land," Effie said simply, closing the ledger. "And perhaps find a bookkeeper eventually, someone in Caldwell who does that work." She stayed through the afternoon and cooked a proper meal while Abraham worked outside and Clara slept in her cradle. And when he came in at dusk, face browned by the autumn sun and his mood noticeably steadier than it had been, she had made a beef stew that he ate with the focused, appreciative silence of a man who had been subsisting on bread and beans for too long. "You did not have to cook," he said. "I was hungry too," she said, which was true and also entirely beside the point, and they both knew it, but neither of them said so. They talked through dinner, and it was the kind of talking that happens when two people discover, somewhat to their own surprise, that they find each other genuinely interesting. Effie told him about growing up in Missouri, the second of 3 children, her father's medical practice, the books she had read and the ones she wanted to read, the particular frustrations of being a woman with a sharp mind in a world that frequently asked women to please set their sharp minds aside and smile pleasantly. Abraham told her about the ranch, about growing up in Kansas, about his father who had homesteaded this land in the early 1860s and had given both his sons an education in the specific stubbornness required to make something out of hard, flat, unyielding ground. He told her about Thomas in a way that was clearly painful but also clearly necessary, the particular way that people talk about the dead when the loss is still fresh, and the talking is how you keep them real. "He was funny," Abraham said, near the end of it. "People did not always see that right away because he was quiet, but he was very funny. He used to make Nora laugh so hard she had to put her hand over her mouth." He looked at Clara in her cradle. "I hope she gets that quality, his particular kind of funny." Effie was quiet for a moment. "Tell me something funny," he said. He did. It was a story about Thomas trying to negotiate with a particularly intractable mule, and Abraham told it with the halting affection of someone who was finding the humor in it again for the first time tentatively, like stepping onto ice and testing its hold. By the end of the story, Effie was laughing quietly, and Abraham was smiling, and Clara woke up and regarded them both with an expression of mild reproach. "There it is," Effie said, looking at Abraham's smile. "I wondered what that looked like." He looked at her, slightly startled by the directness of it. She looked back evenly, untroubled by her own observation. He looked away first, down at Clara, and the tips of his ears went a very slight shade of red that Effie chose, with great discretion, not to remark upon. She rode back to Wellington that evening with the last of the autumn light at her back, and she thought about Abraham Finley's hands on the table, and the way he had looked at his brother's daughter, and the story about the mule, and the smile she had not expected to find so compelling. She told herself firmly that she was helping a family in need, which was consistent with her nature and her values, and that she should not read anything further into the warmth she had felt sitting across that table from him. She rode 2 miles in this firm resolve before abandoning it and acknowledging to herself that Abraham Finley was a remarkable man, and that she would be back next Sunday, and she was, in fact, looking forward to it. She came back the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that, and the one after that, and with each visit Caldwell deepened in her like a second heartbeat she had not expected. The town itself was a vivid place in the autumn of 1882, a cattle-shipping town on the Kishom Trail that had seen its wildest days in the 1870s, but still carried the particular energy of a frontier settlement that was in the process of deciding what it wanted to become. There were churches and a school and a newspaper, but there were also saloons and gamblers and cowboys who rode in with the last of the season's cattle drives, lean and weathered from months on the trail, with boots that had logged more miles than most men walked in a decade. Abraham took her to town one Saturday in October when he needed to collect supplies, and they walked the main street together with Clara in a carry arrangement that Abraham had improved considerably over the weeks, and Effie saw the town through his eyes, which were the eyes of a man who had grown up in its shadow, and was of it in the way that only people who are born into a place can be. He knew everyone. That was what struck her. He knew the man who ran the general store, and the woman who ran the laundry and the blacksmith, and the doctor who was not, it must be said, as good a doctor as Dr. Prout over in Wellington. He knew the cattle agent and the postmaster, and the young couple who had arrived from Tennessee the previous spring with 3 mules and a wagon full of hope. He knew them not in the superficial way of a man who shook hands easily and forgot faces, but in the specific, textured way of a man who paid attention, who asked how your sick mother was doing, and remembered the answer the next time he saw you. He introduced Effie to people as Miss Effie Wallace, who has been a great help to me and to Clara, and every single person he introduced her to looked between them with the particular expression of people who are very pleased about something they are not going to say aloud. "Everyone thinks we are courting," Effie observed after they had left the general store with their supplies. Abraham did not miss a beat. "Are we not?" he said, and his voice was mild and his eyes were on the street ahead of them, and Effie stopped walking for just a moment before she caught herself. She looked at his profile. He was not smiling exactly, but there was something at the corner of his mouth. "That is a very composed way to ask a very significant question," she said. He stopped and looked at her then. In the middle of the crowded main street of Caldwell, Kansas, with Clara asleep against his chest and a sack of flour under one arm, he looked at Effie Wallace with a directness that matched her own. "I'm not always composed," he said, "but I have found that I am clearer in my thinking about most things when you are around, which is something I have not experienced before, and I am honest enough with myself to understand what that means." Effie looked up at him. The October wind moved down the street and lifted a small strand of her hair across her cheek, and she did not push it away. "It has been less than a month," she said. "I know," he said. "You have just lost your brother." "I know," he said again, and his voice was not defensive, just truthful. "I am not asking you to marry me in the street, Effie. I am asking you whether we are in fact courting, because I would like us to be, and I would like to do it properly if you are willing." She was quiet for a moment. Down the street a dog was barking at nothing. A wagon rolled past throwing up a small plume of dust. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." The corner of his mouth became a full and genuine smile, and she thought, as she had before, that it was a very good smile, the kind that a man like Abraham Finley did not deploy casually. "Good," he said. "Then I am taking you to supper after we finish our errands." "You do not have to do that," she said. "I know I do not have to," he said, which was exactly what she had said to him on his porch a month ago, and the recognition of it hit them both at the same moment, and they stood there on the street of Caldwell smiling at each other like two fools. And it was, by almost any measure, a lovely thing. Clara chose that moment to sneeze with enormous force, which broke the spell entirely, and Abraham immediately pulled back the blanket to look at her with parental concern. "She is fine," Effie said, already leaning in to look. "It is just a sneeze. How can you tell the difference between a fine sneeze and a not fine sneeze?" "Experience," Effie said, touching the back of her hand to Clara's forehead in a gesture so automatic it was clearly instinctive, already second nature to her. "She is warm and pink and perfectly well. Put the blanket back." He put the blanket back. He looked at Effie with something in his face that he did not say. She had already started walking toward the next errand. He caught up to her in 2 long strides, and they walked side by side through the busy Saturday street, and if there was not a great deal of space between their arms as they walked, neither of them mentioned it. "Doctor." Harlan Prout, when Effie told him she had agreed to step out with Abraham Finley, took off his spectacles, cleaned them on his shirt in an absent-minded way that meant he was thinking, and put them back on. "The rancher over in Caldwell," he said. "Yes," Effie said. She was preparing a tincture at the apothecary counter and did not look up. "The one whose brother drowned and who has the infant." "His niece." "Yes." Dr. Prout was quiet for a moment. He was a small man in his 60s with a neat white beard and the eyes of someone who had seen enough human suffering to have compassion as a default setting rather than an effort. "He is a good man," he said. "I knew of Thomas Finley slightly. The whole family has a good reputation." "I know," Effie said. "You are not simply attached to the baby," Prout said, and it was the kind of question that was not entirely a question. Effie looked up then. "I am very fond of Clara," she said. "She is an excellent baby, but no, I am not confusing fondness for the baby with something else. I have thought about it carefully." Prout nodded. "You always think about things carefully," he said, which was a compliment. "He thinks carefully too," Effie said, and turned back to her tincture. But there was something in her voice when she said it that the doctor heard clearly. He picked up his bag and went to see his next patient, and he did not say anything more about it. But in the way of someone who has good news, he held it quietly and was pleased. November came in with the particular severity of Kansas autumns, which are not gentle. The wind off the plains had teeth in it, and the sky went from the impossible blue of October to a flat, pressing gray that sat low over the grassland like a lid. Abraham drove out to Wellington one Saturday in his wagon, which he had never done before, having always assumed the driving was Effie's responsibility since she had the horse. But he had 2 cords of firewood in the wagon bed that he had cut and split through the previous 2 weeks, and he delivered half of it to Dr. Prout's house and half of it to the small boarding house where Effie had her room. And when Mrs. Caldecott, who ran the boarding house, asked who it was from, the delivery man said Abraham Finley from Caldwell, and Mrs. Caldecott went immediately to find Effie, who was reading in the parlor. Effie came to the door and found Abraham already stacking the wood neatly against the side of the house, with the focused efficiency of a man who stacks wood well because he has stacked a lot of it. "Abraham," she said, "you drove all the way from Caldwell." "I wanted to see that you were well," he said, not stopping his work, "and the wood needed to go somewhere useful." She leaned against the doorframe and watched him stack wood in the cold November afternoon. He was wearing a heavy coat she had not seen before, canvas-colored, practical, and a hat pulled down against the wind, and he moved with the unself-conscious ease of a man entirely comfortable with his own body, which she had noticed before and noticed again. "I am very well," she said. "How is Clara?" "Clara is marvelous," he said. "She rolled over yesterday, from her back to her stomach, all on her own. Then she seemed quite surprised about it and started to cry." Effie laughed out loud at that, a full, unguarded laugh that surprised her slightly with its own size. That is exactly what they do. They work very hard to accomplish something and then are affronted by the consequences. Abraham finished the last of the stack and stepped back to assess it. Then he turned to look at her in the doorway, and there was 16 feet of cold November air between them, and it felt, somehow, like considerably less. "Will you walk with me?" he said. "There is a decent diner 2 streets over. I passed it on the way in." She got her coat and walked with him. The diner was warm and steaming with the smell of coffee and pie, and they sat at a corner table. And for the first time since the night she had ridden to his ranch with bad news, they were not in his house, not in his territory, and the change in context did something interesting. It made them both slightly more self-conscious and simultaneously more real to each other. "Tell me something I do not know about you," Abraham said. Effie considered this. "I speak a small amount of Spanish," she said. "My father had a patient who was Mexican, and he taught me in exchange for reduced fees. I am not fluent, but I know enough to communicate." Abraham's eyebrows went up. "That is unexpected." "What do you not know about you that I do not know?" she said. He thought. "I wanted to be a painter when I was 12, he said. I told my father. He did not laugh, which I always respected. He said that painting and ranching were not mutually exclusive and gave me a set of watercolors for Christmas. I used them until I ran out and then I went back to ranching. Did you paint anything worth keeping? One thing, he said. A picture of a hawk on a fence post. It is not very good. But I kept it. I would like to see it, she said. He looked at her and said, I would like to show you. The November wind rattled the diner window in its frame, and outside the main street of Wellington was gray and cold, and full of the ordinary business of people living their lives in a hard and beautiful country. Abraham Finley reached across the table and covered Effie Wallace's hand with his own, and she turned her hand over beneath his, and they sat like that through the rest of the coffee, talking, the way people talk when they are learning each other, and finding that what they are learning is better than what they had expected. She came out to the ranch on the first cold Sunday of December and found him in the grip of a genuine domestic crisis, which was that Clara had a slight fever and a new tooth coming in simultaneously, and had expressed her feelings about this situation with spectacular sustained volume since approximately 3 o'clock that morning. Effie came through the door at noon to a scene that would have been comic in any other context. Abraham was standing in the middle of the main room, hat still on from some outdoor task he had abandoned, Clara in his arms screaming at a volume inconsistent with her size, a completely chaotic kitchen visible through the doorway, and an expression on Abraham's face that was not despair exactly, but was in the vicinity. She is teething, Effie said immediately, setting her bag on the table and crossing to them. She ran her finger along Clara's lower gum and felt the small, hard ridge of the tooth working its way up, and Clara bit down on her finger with ferocious determination. Yes, there it is, first tooth. Is that normal? Abraham said. This level of unhappiness. Absolutely normal, Effie said. She was already digging in her bag. I brought clove oil. I thought I might need it given her age. You thought ahead, he said. I usually do, she said. She administered a tiny amount of clove oil to Clara's gum, which produced a brief moment of startled silence from the baby, followed by a more manageable, if still vocal, unhappiness. Then Effie held her and walked, in the specific long oval she had established over weeks as the path that Clara responded to best, around the main room, through the kitchen doorway, back through the main room, while Abraham collapsed into a chair at the table with the air of a man who has reached his absolute limit and arrived somewhere beyond it where things were simply absurd. I burned the oatmeal this morning, he said, because she started crying very loudly while I was making it, and I forgot to move it off the heat. The cat that lives in the barn somehow got into the house, and I have not been able to locate it for 2 hours. And at some point while I was dealing with all of this, it began to snow. Effie looked at the window. It was, in fact, snowing. The first snow of the season, a thin and preliminary snow, but snow. The cat will find its own way out, she said. I will make fresh oatmeal. You are going to eat it without burning it, and then you are going to tell me what else needs doing. He looked up at her from the chair. Clara had quieted to a damp-faced, heavy-eyed drowsiness in Effie's arms. I do not know what I would do without you, he said, and his voice was very quiet and very plain, and it was not a sentiment he had dressed up or arranged, just the bare truth of a thing. Effie felt it land. She felt the whole weight of it, what it meant and what it did not yet mean and what it could mean, and she held his niece against her shoulder and looked at Abraham Finley sitting in his kitchen chair in the first snow of December, and she thought, with a clarity that was both terrifying and luminous, that she did not want to go back to Wellington. She wanted to stay. She did not say that. She said, sit still, and went to make the oatmeal, and he sat still, and Clara fell asleep. They buried Thomas properly on a mild Saturday in early December, when the ground was not yet too hard. Abraham had arranged it with the minister in Caldwell once the shock of the first weeks had eased enough for him to think about the practical matters of grief. Thomas had been interred in Wellington when he passed, which was necessary then, but Abraham had made arrangements to bring his brother home, to the small cemetery on the edge of the Finley family land where their parents also lay. Effie came for it. She had not asked whether she should. She had simply arrived the morning of, dressed in a dark blue dress that was her most somber, with a small bunch of dried prairie flowers she had collected and tied with a ribbon, and Abraham looked at her coming up the porch steps and could not speak for a moment. There were perhaps 30 people from Caldwell and the surrounding ranches, people who had known the Finley family. People came in the way that people came to these things in small communities, because presence was what you offered when there was nothing else to offer. Abraham stood at the graveside with Clara in his arms, and Effie stood beside him, and when the minister spoke and Abraham's composure fractured, just briefly, just a hairline crack in the surface of it, Effie put her hand on his arm and left it there, and he covered her hand with his own without looking away from the grave. Afterward, people came back to the ranch house and ate the food that several neighbor women had brought, and Effie moved through it all with a quiet competence that people noticed, that eased the practical chaos of a gathering held in a house run by a man alone. And by the end of the afternoon, she had been folded into the Caldwell community with an organic, unforced naturalness that surprised even her. Mrs. Havorson, the closest neighbor, found her in the kitchen at one point. "You are the doctor's woman from Wellington," Mrs. Havorson said. She was a large, comfortable woman with a direct Scandinavian manner that Effie found she liked immediately. "I am Dr. Pruitt's assistant," Effie said. "Miss Effie Wallace," said Mrs. Havorson in the way of someone who has all the information they need. "Abraham is a good man. He has had a very hard year, a very hard few years, truthfully. He was not always so solitary before." She handed Effie a dish to dry. "But he is steadier with you around. I can see it." Effie dried the dish and did not say anything immediately. "I am fond of him," she said finally, because it was true and Mrs. Havorson had earned a real answer. "Good," said Mrs. Havorson, and went back to her washing up. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Abraham drove to Wellington twice, and Effie came out to the ranch twice, and between those visits they wrote letters. This was Abraham's suggestion, which surprised Effie slightly, because she had not taken him for a man who wrote letters readily, but his letters were as he was in conversation, clear and particular and full of the specific details that showed what he was paying attention to. He wrote about Clara learning to sit up, supported, and regarding the world from this new perspective with great seriousness. He wrote about a hawk he had seen on the fence post near the east pasture and thought of his watercolor painting. He wrote about the way the winter prairie looked in the flat white light of December, which he said he did not have the skill to paint but tried to describe in words, and was not sure he had the skill for that either, though the attempt took 3/4 of a page and was, in Effie's private opinion, quite beautiful. She wrote back about the cases she and Dr. Pruitt had seen, about a woman she had helped deliver a healthy boy to after a long and frightening labor, about a sentence in a medical journal she had read that she thought was wrong and had argued with at length in the margins. She wrote about Wellington in the winter, which was less romantic than she made it, but she found things in it that were worth saying. She wrote that she had been thinking about his offer to show her the hawk painting. He wrote back and said the offer was open indefinitely. She came for Christmas. She told herself it was because he had invited her, which was true. She told herself it was because Clara should have company at the holiday, which was also true. She told herself a third thing that she did not examine closely, and that had everything to do with the way she felt when she walked through his door. She arrived on Christmas Eve with a box of things she had made and bought, practical gifts, and a few that were less so, including a set of good quality paints and brushes that she had ordered from a supplier in Kansas City after some discreet inquiry about what quality ranched painters might prefer. When he opened them, he was quiet for a long time. "You remembered," he said. "I remember everything you tell me," she said. And then, because she had found that she was braver with him than she generally was with most people, That is one of the consequences of finding someone genuinely interesting. He looked at her with the paints in his hands and the Christmas Eve fire behind him and Clara asleep in her cradle in the corner and the winter pressing against the window glass, and he said, "I have been wanting to ask you something." "Then ask," she said. "I know it has only been a few months," he said, "and I know you have your work in Wellington and your life there, and I do not want to rush you, and I understand that things are not simple. But I want to be honest with you because that is the only thing I know how to be." "I know," she said. "You are the most honest person I have met in a long time." "I love you," he said. Plain and clear and unhurried, the way he said everything that mattered to him. I did not expect to. I did not particularly expect anything when I opened my door and found you there. But I do, and I wanted you to know it, and I wanted to ask you when you are ready if you would consider staying. Not just Sundays, staying. The fire moved in the hearth. Outside, the December wind was very still, as though it too was waiting. Effie Wallace looked at Abraham Finley, and she felt the weight of what he was asking and the rightness of it, and the enormous, slightly terrifying scope of a life she could see very clearly if she chose it. "I have been ready for a while," she said, and her voice was steady because she was sure. "I have just been waiting until it felt right to say it." He crossed the room to her in 3 steps and he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that is both a beginning and an arrival, something that has been traveling toward itself for months. Clara made a small sound from her cradle, the contented sound of a sleeping baby settling deeper into sleep, and it was so perfectly timed that Abraham laughed against Effie's mouth, and she felt his laughter before she heard it, and she started laughing too, and they stood there in his ranch house on Christmas Eve in 1882 laughing and holding each other while the fire burned and the winter held still outside. "She has excellent timing," Effie said. "She always does," Abraham agreed. They were engaged by the new year. It was not a grand announcement. It was a conversation over breakfast on the 1st of January, 1883, in which Abraham asked formally and Effie said yes formally, and they shook hands on it, which immediately struck them both as ridiculous and made them laugh again. And then he put a ring on her finger that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet, and she looked at it on her hand and thought that it suited her perfectly, which it did. There were practical things to be worked out, and they worked them out with the same methodical honesty they brought to everything. Effie would speak to Dr. Prout about finishing her work in Wellington with appropriate notice, which she estimated at 6 weeks. Abraham would prepare the ranch house for a woman living there full-time, which he said he was already doing because he had been half preparing it in his mind since October. Dr. Prout, when Effie told him, cleaned his spectacles again, a gesture she had come to understand as his version of gathering himself emotionally. "You are happy," he said. "Yes," she said. "Then I am glad," he said. He put his spectacles back on. "I will need you through February at the very least." "Of course," she said. "And you will still come to me if I need you." "Not permanently, I understand that, but if something arises, if there is a complicated case, if someone in Caldwell needs a physician's assistant who actually knows what she is doing." "Always," she said. He nodded, satisfied with the logistics, and then he did something he had never done before, which was put one hand briefly on her shoulder in the gesture of a father proud of a daughter. "He is a lucky man," he said. "I hope he knows it." "He seems to," Effie said. She moved to the ranch in March, when the prairie was beginning its tentative spring, the first green showing through the dead gold of the winter grass, the sky returning to its impossible Kansas blue. She brought what she owned, which fit in 2 trunks and a bag, and was not a great deal in terms of quantity but was rich in the specific things she valued, books and medical references and small personal objects, and the set of letters Abraham had written her, which she had kept carefully. Abraham met her wagon at the end of the track, which he did not have to do but did because he wanted to see her arrive. He helped carry her trunks inside, and she moved through his house with the particular, proprietary ease of someone who has been thinking about where they want to put things for quite a long time. And he watched her, and felt a happiness so specific, and deep it was almost solemn. Clara, who was now 6 months old, had a great deal to say about everything, which was to say that she had recently developed a range of vocalizations that stopped short of words, but were clearly communicating something of importance, and she addressed these to Effie at length upon her arrival, which Effie received with great seriousness. "She is telling you about the last few weeks," Abraham said. "She is very thorough." "I can see that," Effie said, reaching down to scoop Clara up, and Clara grabbed a fistful of her hair immediately, which was a sign of deep affection and also faintly painful. They were married in April in the church in Caldwell, on a morning when the wild plums were blooming along the creek, and the whole of the visible world was green and flowering. It was a small wedding by the standards of some, perhaps 40 people, but it was full. Mrs. Haverson cried, which she would have denied if asked. Dr. Prout came all the way from Wellington and stood in the front row with the straight-backed dignity of a man at an important occasion. Several of the cattle ranchers from the county attended and brought their families. Clara wore a dress that Effie had made for her from a length of soft white cotton, and she sat in Mrs. Haverson's arms during the ceremony and regarded the proceedings with the focused attention she brought to all things, as though she was cataloging it for later use. Abraham Finley stood at the altar and watched Effie Wallace walk toward him, and whatever had been remaining of the careful composure he maintained as a habit fell entirely away, and his face was open and unguarded in a way that everyone in the church who knew him had never seen before, and it was, by any account, very moving. Effie arrived at his side and looked up at him, and she was smiling the smile that was not careful, the smile she reserved for him, and the minister began to speak, and they were married in the spring in Kansas in 1883 while the plum blossoms fell outside the open church windows. The first years were good years. Hard in the ways that ranch life was always hard, marked by the practical beauties and challenges of working land and raising cattle, and managing the 10,000 small crises that composed a life built from scratch in the open country. But good. Fundamentally, persistently good. Effie did not entirely abandon her medical work. This had been her condition, stated plainly before the wedding, which Abraham had accepted without argument because he understood that it was essential to her. She established a kind of informal practice out of the ranch house, nothing official, but the word spread among the families in the surrounding county that Effie Finley had medical knowledge and was willing to help. And so women came to her with questions about their children and their pregnancies and the ailments of family members, and she helped them with what she had, and referred them to Dr. Prout when needed. She rode to Wellington several times a year to work alongside Prout on complicated cases, and he was always glad to see her, and always slightly annoyed that she had left, which was his version of saying he missed having her there daily. She brought him jars of the preserves she had begun making in the autumn, and he accepted them with a dignity that did not quite disguise his pleasure. Clara grew. She grew in the specific way of a child who is thoroughly loved by two people, with a confidence that was not arrogance, but was the deep, rooted assurance of someone who knows they are wanted. She called Effie Mama from the time she was 14 months old, which she arrived at herself without prompting, and which Effie heard for the first time on a Tuesday morning in June while she was hanging laundry, and she had to sit down for a moment because the size of what she felt was larger than she was prepared for. She told Abraham that evening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did you say to her when she said it?" "I said yes," Effie said. "That is exactly what I am." He reached across the dinner table and took her hand. Clara talked about Thomas sometimes, as she grew older and was told about him, the way that children incorporate the dead into their living understanding of family. Abraham told her stories about her father with the same affection and the particular humor he had used to describe Thomas to Effie on that first evening, and Clara absorbed them with the seriousness that was so characteristically her own, and kept them. In the spring of 1885, When Clara was just past 2.5 and fully verbal and had strong opinions about everything, Effie told Abraham she was expecting. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, straightforwardly, because that was how she told important things. She was fairly certain, she said. She had checked herself with the same care she would check any of her patients. Abraham sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at her, and then he reached across and took both her hands in his, and she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady, which was not something she had encountered before because his hands were always steady. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "You know what can go wrong. I know perhaps more than I should, given my work." "I know," he said. He squeezed her hands. "But you know more than most about how to keep things from going wrong." "That is true," she said, and allowed herself a small, useful confidence in it. "We are going to be all right," he said. "We are," she agreed. Their son was born in November of 1885, on a night when the winter wind came in early off the plains and the first true cold of the season descended over the ranch. Abraham was beside her the entire time, which was not standard in that era. But Effie was not a woman who did things because they were standard, and she wanted him there, and so he was there. Dr. Prout attended, having made the drive from Wellington without being asked, because he had received the letter from Abraham 2 days prior and decided immediately that he was going. The boy came into the world at just past midnight, and he was very loud about his arrival, which Dr. Prout said was an excellent sign. He was pink and furious, and had Abraham's dark hair in the improbable quantity that some newborns have, as though they have been preparing it for quite some time. They named him James Thomas Finley, James for Abraham's father, and Thomas for his brother, which was the simplest and most complete gesture they could find. Clara, who was 2.5 and had been allowed to stay at Mrs. Havorson's for the night, was brought home the next morning and introduced to her cousin brother with enormous ceremony. She looked at James Thomas for a long time. Then she reached out one careful finger and touched his cheek. "He is very small," she said. "You were small too," Abraham told her. "I am big now," she said. "Very big," Effie agreed from the bed. Clara considered James Thomas for another moment. "He can sleep in my room," she said finally in the tone of someone granting a significant concession. "But he cannot touch my things." "He cannot touch anything yet," Abraham said. "He can barely move." Clara assessed this. "He can have the rabbit," she decided. This was the stuffed rabbit that was her most prized possession, and everyone in the room understood the enormity of the gift. "He looks like he needs it." Effie looked at her daughter across the room and felt the particular, enormous gratitude of a woman who knows she is exactly where she is supposed to be. The years continued to accumulate, and each one laid itself down over the last like the rings of a tree, building something solid and layered. Abraham's cattle operation grew steadily. He took on 2 ranch hands in the summer of 1886, young men from Caldwell named Pete and Rodrigo, and they were good workers who became part of the rhythm of the place. Effie continued her work, which she formalized somewhat as her reputation grew, establishing regular visiting hours and keeping the same meticulous records she had learned under Dr. Prout. She delivered 7 babies in the county in 1886 alone, including Mrs. Havorson's 7th, who arrived in February in a roaring snowstorm with Effie there through the whole of it, cool and efficient and encouraging in equal measure. And Mrs. Havorson afterwards said that Effie Finley was worth 3 of the doctor in Wellington, which was not fair to Dr. Prout, but was offered in the spirit of genuine gratitude. There were harder things too, because the West in the 1880s did not offer uncomplicated happiness to anyone for very long. A drought in the summer of 1886 hit the cattle ranchers hard, and Abraham had to make difficult decisions about the herd, selling earlier than he wanted to at lower prices, trimming the operation back to what could be sustained through a dry year. He did it without panic and without complaint, working the numbers with Effie at the kitchen table in the evenings the way they worked everything, together and honestly. There were things in the county that troubled Effie deeply, as they troubled any person with a conscience who looked at the West without the comfort of looking away. She saw the Kiowa families who passed through the area, dispossessed and marginalized by decades of treaties broken and land taken. And she was not naive about what that meant or how it had happened, and she said so when she had occasion to say so, quietly but without equivocation, because she was not built for comfortable silences around injustice. Abraham listened to her and did not argue because he shared the discomfort, though he expressed it less readily, his character being to observe more than to speak on things he felt he did not fully understand. She helped where she could, which was limited but was not nothing. When a Kiowa woman came to the ranch one afternoon in the summer of 1887 with a sick child, Effie did not hesitate, and she treated the child with the same care and the same thoroughness she brought to any patient. And the woman, who spoke limited English and did not stay long, looked at Effie before she left with an expression that contained something vast and unspoken, and Effie met it steadily, and neither of them looked away. She told Abraham about it that evening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You are a good person, Effie." "I just do what is right," she said. "I know," he said. "That is what I said." In the spring of 1888, when James Thomas was 2 and Clara was 5 and beginning her education at the schoolhouse in Caldwell, Effie told Abraham she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening over supper, and he looked at her with the same expression he had worn 3 years ago, open and overwhelmed and grateful. "Are you frightened again?" he said. "Less," she said. "You?" "Less," he agreed. "Good," she said, and reached across the table and put her hand briefly on his, and then went back to her supper. Clara looked between them with the 5-year-old's superb instinct for undercurrents. "What?" she said. "You are going to have a baby brother or sister," Abraham told her. Clara considered this carefully. "I already have a brother," she said. "He is noisy." "He has improved," Abraham said. "Somewhat," Clara conceded. James Thomas, oblivious to the judgment being rendered, was dismantling a bread roll with cheerful determination on the other side of the table. The second child was a girl, born in October of 1888 on a golden autumn afternoon that felt like an apology for the previous year's drought, the sky enormous and blue, the air clean. Effie had been correct that it was easier the second time, though Dr. Prout was there again, because he had made it his personal policy to be there, and no one was inclined to argue with him. They named her Rose Eleanor Finley. The Eleanor was for Effie's mother, who had died when Effie was 17, a loss she had carried quietly all this time. Abraham held his daughter for the first time and looked at her with the expression Effie had seen on his face when he was moved by something that was larger than language, and she lay in the bed and watched him with Rose Eleanor in his arms and thought, as she sometimes thought, about the evening she had knocked on his door with the worst news of his year. How close it had all been to not happening, how a different doctor might have gone in her place, how she might have left in the morning and not offered to come back. How grief and circumstance and two people's willingness to look honestly at each other had compacted into the life she was living, this particular beautiful life, which she would not have exchanged for any other. Dr. Prout, washing his hands at the basin in the corner, turned around to find both of the Finleys looking at each other across the room with their new daughter between them, and he picked up his bag and went quietly outside to give them a moment. And he stood on the porch of the Finley ranch in the October afternoon with the Kansas sky very large above him and felt, as he rarely allowed himself to feel, that things were very well. Clara was given the honor of formally meeting her sister first, before James Thomas, because she was 5 and could be trusted to be gentle, and she took this responsibility with tremendous seriousness. She sat in the chair beside the bed and held Rose Eleanor with the careful rigidity of someone performing an important task, and looked at her with those dark, serious eyes that she had always had and said, "She has my nose." "You might have her nose," Abraham said. "She arrived first." Clara considered this philosophical claim and declined to concede it. James Thomas was then brought in, and he regarded his sister with the frank assessment of a 2-year-old. And then he patted her head with an enthusiasm that had to be modulated, and said "baby" with enormous satisfaction, and tried to share his bread roll with her, which was a gesture of pure love from him and was redirected by Effie with gentle expertise. They grew, all three of them. They grew in the specific ways of children who are shaped by both the land they live on and the parents they have. And the particular combination of Abraham's steadiness and Effie's intelligence and curiosity gave them a quality of thoughtfulness that their teachers at the Caldwell schoolhouse remarked upon. Clara was the serious one, precise and careful, and there were people who already said she had her mother's mind. James Thomas was the one who laughed easily and made other people laugh, and there were people who said he had his father Thomas's kind of humor, which moved Abraham when he heard it in a way that was painful and deeply satisfying at once. Rosalina was something else entirely, her own particular self, which is the way of children who arrive third and have already been partly formed by the two who came before them, and she was both quieter and fiercer than either of them. In the summer of 1890, Abraham finished the Hawk painting. He had started it in February, using the good paints Effie had given him for Christmas 8 years ago, and had worked on it in the evenings by lamplight through all the months between. On the particular February evening, when a hawk had sat on his fence post long enough for him to observe it with real attention, he showed it to Effie on a Sunday afternoon, carrying it in from the barn where he had kept it, wrapped in cloth. He set it on the kitchen table and unwrapped it and stood back and looked at the wall, not at her, because he was more uncertain about this than about most things. She looked at it for a long time. The hawk was painted with a precision that was learned and a feeling that was entirely natural, the way that real talent shows itself, not as showiness but as truth. The bird on the post had a specific quality of stillness, that alert, weighted stillness of a predator at rest, and behind it the Kansas sky was the exact particular blue that it was in the mornings of summer and that she had never seen painted correctly before. "Abraham," she said. "It is not very good," he said to the wall. "It is very good," she said. "It is genuinely, honestly good. This belongs on a wall." He turned to look at her. She was looking at the painting with the focused expression she had when she was reading something true, and he could tell she meant it, not as kindness but as assessment. "Here," she said, and she carried the painting to the wall beside the fireplace where the light was best, and she held it up. "Here, this is where it goes." He hung it there that afternoon. It stayed there for the rest of their lives. Clara turned 12 in 1895, and she announced with her characteristic direct precision that she intended to be a physician. She said this at dinner with the particular certainty of someone who has made a decision slowly and privately, and is now prepared to make it public. She looked at her father first and then at her mother. Effie set down her fork. "Then you will be a physician," she said simply. Abraham looked at his daughter and then at his wife and said, "It will not be easy, you already know that." "I know," Clara said. "Mama did not find it easy either." "No," Effie agreed. "It is not easy, but it is possible. And I will teach you everything I know, and Dr. Prout will teach you everything he knows, and when the time comes, we will find you a proper medical education." Clara looked at her with those serious dark eyes. "Do you think they will let me in?" Effie looked at her steadily. "Some of them will refuse you because you are a woman. That has not changed, and it will not change as fast as it should. But the doors are opening, Clara, and you have a mind that can force them further open. Yes, I think they will let you in." James Thomas had been listening to all of this. He was 9 and broadly impressed by everything his sister did. "Can I be a physician too?" he said. "You can be anything you work hard enough for," Abraham said. "I want to be a rancher," Rosalina said from her end of the table, which was characteristic of her and made everyone else smile. "Good," Abraham said. "I need someone to take over the east pasture." "Not yet," she said. "I am 7. "Fair point," he said, "Doctor." Harlan Prout passed away in the spring of 1896, at the age of 74, which was a good age for a man who had worked that hard for that long. He died in his sleep, which was the easiest way to go, and he left his medical practice to a young doctor from Topeka and his collection of medical texts to Effie, along with a letter that she read sitting at the kitchen table in the morning light, and could not afterward fully summarize, because it said the things that he had never said aloud in the 17 years she had known him, which were that she was the best assistant he had ever had, and that knowing her had made him a better doctor, and that he was glad he had sent her to deliver the news to the rancher in Caldwell, because it had worked out rather well. She kept the letter. She cried, which she did privately and briefly, in the way that Effie cried things, because she was not a woman who performed her grief, but she was not a woman who denied it either. Abraham found her in the barn an hour later, brushing down her mare with the focused, mechanical care of someone who needs to do something with her hands. He did not say anything. He came and stood beside her and put his hand on her back, and she leaned into him for a moment, just a moment, and then straightened and kept brushing. "He was a good man," she said. "He was," Abraham agreed. "He gave me a great deal," she said. Abraham thought about what Dr. Prout had given her, which included the work she loved and the path she had taken, and at the end of that path his own door and his own porch in the November evening she had knocked and said, "He gave us a great deal." She looked at him, and the grief in her face softened into something that was still grief and also something else entirely. "Yes," she said, "he did." The years of the new century approached and arrived. The world was changing, as it always is, and the wild west of the cattle drives and the Kisham Trail was becoming something different, more settled, less raw, the particular wildness domesticated into something that would eventually be called history. Abraham watched it with the equanimity of a man who had always understood that land changes, but does not disappear, that what you build on it is what matters. The Finley Ranch weathered the drought years and the good years, and the lean years of the 1890s with the same practiced resilience. Abraham's cattle operation remained viable because he was careful and adaptable, and because Effie brought an intelligence to the business side of it that he had relied on for years now without embarrassment, having learned early in their marriage that pride that refused good counsel was not a virtue. Clara left for medical school in 1902, which was the same year that several women's medical colleges in the country had become accessible to serious female applicants, and she was accepted at a program in Kansas City after an application process that was exactly as difficult as Effie had predicted, and no worse, which Effie counted as progress. She stood on the porch with Abraham and watched their eldest leave in the mail coach and felt the particular clean grief of a parent who has raised a child well enough that they can go. Abraham's arm was around her shoulders. "She will be all right," he said. "I know," Effie said. "She is better prepared than I was." "You turned out well," he said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "We turned out well," she said. James Thomas had indeed gone into ranching alongside his father, not because he lacked alternatives, but because he genuinely loved it, which was the right reason. He had his father's feel for the land and his Uncle Thomas's humor and his mother's unexpected practicality. And by the time he was in his late teens, he was managing significant portions of the operation, with a competence that Abraham regarded with the quiet pride of a man who has built something that will continue. Rosa Leaner, true to her declaration at the age of 7, had taken up the east pasture and was managing it with a fiercer effectiveness than anyone had expected, which should perhaps have been expected given her character. She had also, at the age of 16, announced her intention to expand the vegetable operation attached to the ranch into something that could supply the town of Caldwell regularly, which she proceeded to do with a systematic efficiency that Effie found both familiar and satisfying. "She has your mind," Abraham told Effie one evening. "She has your stubbornness," Effie replied. "We gave her excellent material," he said. On the evening of their 20th wedding anniversary, April of 1903, Abraham took Effie for a long ride out to the east pasture at dusk, the way they had done many times over the years, the two of them on horseback with the Kansas sky going enormous shades of copper and rose above the flat horizon. They stopped at the high point of the pasture, which was not particularly high by the standards of other landscapes but was the highest point on their land, and they could see for miles in every direction, the grass moving in the evening wind, the lights of Caldwell beginning to appear in the distance, the creek winding away southward. 20 years, Abraham said. 20 years, Effie agreed. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small package wrapped in paper and handed it to her. She opened it and found inside a watercolor painting, small enough to fit in both her hands, of a woman standing in a doorway in the last of an autumn evening's light, a satchel over her shoulder looking in. It was herself as she had looked that first evening, arriving at his door. She looked at it for a long time. The painting had the same quality as the hawk, precision and feeling together, the specific truth of something carefully seen. "You remembered what I looked like," she said. "I have not forgotten a single thing about that evening," he said. "I was holding a baby and I thought I was entirely lost, and then there you were." She looked up at him with 20 years between them and everything they had built, and the children they had made and the land that held them and the lives that had grown up inside all of it. "You were not lost," she said. "You were waiting." He took the painting carefully from her hands and wrapped it back in its paper and tucked it safely in his coat. And then he took her face in his hands and kissed her in the April evening, while the last light fell and the prairie held them up, and it was not less than it had been 20 years ago in front of the Christmas fire. It was more. It was what love becomes when it has been lived in, when it has been tested and proven and returned to again and again, when it has survived grief and drought and time and come through all of them not diminished but deepened. She rode home with him through the dusk, and the spring evening smelled of green things and the creek and the horses. And all along the road back to the ranch house, the prairie was alive with the beginning of night, crickets starting up, and the stars coming out one by one in the enormous Kansas sky. They came home to lights in the windows, which meant the children were there. Clara home from Kansas City for the occasion, James Thomas in from the east pasture, Rose Aliner in from the garden, all three of them having conspired to make a proper celebration dinner while their parents were away. Clara directing the cooking with her characteristic precise authority, and James Thomas managing the humor of the whole situation, and Rose Aliner producing from somewhere a jar of preserved plums that she announced were from the same wild plum trees that had bloomed outside the church on the morning of their parents' wedding. Abraham stood in the doorway of his house and looked at all of it and felt the specific fullness of a man who has exactly what he needs and knows it, which is the rarest and most complete form of wealth. Effie came in behind him and surveyed her family around the table, the three of them grown and distinct and real, and the house that was fully and finally hers, and the man who had opened his door to her all those years ago with a screaming baby, and unlaced boots and red eyes and a grief that had not broken him because he was not a man who broke. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the best decisions she had ever made were the ones that looked, on their surface, like simple kindness. She had ridden out to deliver bad news. She had stayed to help with a baby. And here, in this warm and lamplight kitchen with her family around her and 20 years of a life she had chosen fully and without reservation, was everything that staying had made. Clara raised a glass of cider and looked between her parents with those dark, serious eyes that had been serious since she was a newborn, and she said, "To 20 years, and to whatever comes next." "Whatever comes next," Abraham said, and looked at Effie. "Whatever comes next," she agreed, and meant it completely, because whatever came next was going to be met the way she had always met things, with clear eyes and steady hands and the specific kind of love that does not flinch. The hawk painting stayed above the fireplace for as long as the house stood. The ring with the small garnet never left her hand, and the ranch on the outskirts of Caldwell, Kansas, which had seen grief and hard work and great joy, and the particular complicated beauty of lives fully committed to each other, went on under that enormous sky, season after season, as all the best things do.